Welcome, traveler. Tonight we're taking a slow golden walk through a world where beauty was poisonous, and everyday life could quietly kill you. This is the Victorian era at its most elegant and most deadly. A time when bakers, hatters, and housewives breathed in death disguised as progress. If you like history told softly, with a bit of dry humor, quiet tragedy, and the strange comfort of old stories, then stay right where you are. Dim the lights, settle in, and let's drift back to an age that tried to make even dying look beautiful. Hey guys, tonight we're sinking into something that sounds cozy at first, but really wasn't. We're talking about bread. Yes, the soft, warm, innocent stuff you might be eating right now. But back in Victorian England, bread wasn't just a snack, and it was a silent killer. So, grab your blanket, dim the lights, and let's take a slow, sleepy walk through the fog of 19th century London, where the streets smelled faintly of coal smoke, horse manure, and occasionally death by pastry. Because tonight's story isn't about kings or queens, it's about the people who fed them, or more accurately, the people who poisoned everyone by accident. Welcome to the world of the Victorian baker, a profession so deadly it makes medieval dentistry look like a spa day. The poison loaf problem. Now, in the 1800s, bread was everything. It was the heart of the working-class diet. If you couldn't afford meat, you ate bread. If you could afford meat, you still ate bread, mostly to pretend the tiny bit of meat you had was a meal, and because of that, bakers held an oddly powerful position. Not like noble powerful, but we control the carbs of the nation powerful. Unfortunately, they were also quietly killing people. Not on purpose, at least not most of them. It was more of a corporate negligence meets ignorance situation. See, real white bread was expensive. White flour required refined, clean wheat. But the lower classes couldn't pay for that. So bakers, ever resourceful, found ways to stretch their ingredients. You know, like we do today with oat milk and cauliflower pizza crusts. Except the Victorians didn't have cauliflower flour. They had alum, a white mineral powder used for tanning leather, fixing dyes, and occasionally whitening bread. It gave loaves a lovely pale color and made them seem lighter and softer. Unfortunately, it also gave people chronic stomach pain, constipation, and long-term organ damage. But hey, the bread looked great. Bread that glowed in the worst way. Bakers didn't stop at alum. They also used chalk, plaster of Paris, and even ground-up bones to bulk out their flour. Yes, you heard that right. Your average London loaf might have contained a small percentage of dead cow shin. And because flour was milled in open, dusty mills, it often picked up other little treats, like lead dust, arsenic, or bits of rat. All of this meant that every sandwich, every breakfast roll, every crust lovingly dipped into soup came with a risk of chemical seasoning, and people noticed. Bread made people sick. But the Victorians had a weird tolerance for suffering. If you had a stomachache, it was probably the air, or the water, or ghosts. Definitely not the bread. The baker's life, hot, miserable, and short. Let's talk about the bakers themselves. These weren't cheerful, flour-dusted artisans humming over a sourdough starter. No, Findig, your average 19th century baker lived a life of sleepless misery. They worked in small, airless cellars with massive coal-fired ovens that never went out. Bakers often started work around midnight, kneading dough until dawn, covered in sweat and soot. The heat was so intense that many baked shirtless, which led to delightful newspaper reports of sweat bread, because, yes, some of that perspiration made it into the dough. Delicious. They slept in brief naps during the day, often right on flour sacks in the same room as the ovens. So imagine sleeping in a 100-degree kitchen, your lungs full of flour dust, your skin burned, and your clothes permanently sticky. Victorian bakers had the lifespan of a mayfly, a nation addicted to white. But why go through all that trouble? Because Victorian England had a full-blown bread colour obsession. Brown bread was dirty. White bread meant wealth, purity, and sophistication, the kind of thing you'd eat while silently judging the poor, so bakers kept poisoning themselves and their customers just to meet the aesthetic. And the government. They mostly looked the other way. There were laws technically against adulterating food, but enforcement was a joke. Testing bread for alum wasn't easy. And besides, who was going to rat out the neighborhood baker when you still had to buy your breakfast there tomorrow? It wasn't until journalists started poking around, literally tasting the bread and nearly dying, that anyone paid attention. The chemist Frederick Ackham famously published a treatise on adulterations of food and culinary poisons in 1820. He exposed how widespread the problem was, not just bread, but everything. Milk watered down with chalk, coffee padded with burnt sugar and dirt, even pickles dyed bright green with copper. He tried to warn people. The response? The food industry called him a liar, burned his reputation and drove him out of England. Because apparently Victorian capitalism ran on equal parts profit and powdered poison. Pure bread. The 19th century health craze. Eventually, reformers started pushing for pure bread. The irony? They didn't really know what pure meant. Some wanted whole wheat. Some wanted unsweetened. Some wanted bread that didn't kill you. All noble goals. The 1860 Adulteration Act was the first serious attempt to regulate food ingredients, but by then, an entire generation had grown up on toxic toast. Even after the law passed, cheating continued quietly. People wanted cheap bread, and bakers wanted to survive. The public's faith in bread only recovered when industrial mills and brand-name loaves appeared. A loaf with a factory label suddenly meant safety, even though those factories weren't exactly hygienic either. But at least no one was mixing their dough with plaster. The bakers' revolt bakers didn't just suffer chemically, they also fought socially. By the mid-1800s they began organizing, complaining about their brutal hours. Night work was their biggest enemy. They'd start at midnight, finish around noon, collapse, then do it all again. The early closing movement pushed for bakers to work during the day instead, claiming that overnight labor destroyed their health. They weren't wrong. Chronic heat exposure, flour lung and exhaustion made them old before their time. Some bakers in their 30s looked like grandfathers, if they lived that long. Even Charles Dickens, ever the champion of the overworked, mentioned bakers' suffering. He described them as pale, dusty ghosts of men, half alive from lack of sleep. And when Dickens says you look haunted, that's saying something. A side of death with your breakfast. So picture this. You're a Londoner in 1840. You shuffle into a bakery. It's warm, the shelves are lined with soft white loaves. You hand over a few pence, take home your bread and share it with your family. It's comforting, filling, and slowly poisoning you with alum, chalk, and a sprinkle of lead. Meanwhile, the man who baked it is coughing up flour dust in a 120-degree cellar, dreaming of fresh air. By the time the sun rises, he's collapsed on a flour sack, too tired to notice the soot in his lungs. The Victorian bread industry wasn't evil, just tragically practical. Everyone was poor. Everything was dirty, and the priority was survival. Clean, honest bread was a luxury only the upper classes could afford. So yes, being a baker in the Victorian era was a deadly job, physically, chemically, and socially. But at least it gave us one good thing, the eventual birth of food safety laws, because apparently society had to almost poison itself to death before deciding maybe, just maybe, flour shouldn't double as drywall. Let's drift onward now, from one deadly profession to another. If bakers were slow killers by flour, then Victorian chimney sweeps were tiny martyrs of soot. Next time we'll follow them up the flues, into a world of narrow chimneys, black lungs, and a nation powered by children small enough to fit inside its machinery. Stay cozy, and let's keep wandering softly through the darker corners of the past. Hey again! If you're still awake, or just pleasantly half asleep, let's float further down the foggy streets of Victorian London. We've already covered the bakers, quietly poisoning their customers with chalk and ambition. Now we're climbing into a darker corner, literally. Because our next story belongs to the chimney sweeps, the smallest and sootiest members of the working class. And trust me, if you think your job is bad, imagine spending your childhood inside a fireplace. Tiny humans, enormous chimneys. So, here's the thing. During the 18th and 19th centuries, the Industrial Revolution was booming. Factories belched smoke into the sky. Homes burned coal all day. And every single chimney in London, all tens of thousands of them, needed cleaning constantly. Otherwise, soot built up, fires broke out, and rich Victorians couldn't enjoy their tea by the hearth. And who do you call when your chimney's clogged? Apparently, children. Very small children, usually between 5 and 8 years old. Because those narrow flues, some as small as 9 inches across, weren't exactly adult-friendly. They were known as climbing boys, though sometimes girls were used too. These were mostly orphans, or kids sold by desperate parents to master sweeps. And by sold, I don't mean hired. I mean purchased, outright. A sweepmaster would feed, clothe, and train the child in exchange for their labor. The Victorians somehow managed to make child slavery sound like an apprenticeship. Inside the chimney, imagine being 6 years old, waking up before dawn, covered in soot, and told to climb into a narrow brick tube with a brush and a scraper. No safety gear, no gloves, just your bare hands and knees. The boys would wriggle their way up like spiders, scraping soot off the walls. If they slipped, they could fall 20 or 30 feet straight down into the fireplace below. If they got stuck, which happened often, the master might light a small fire at the base to motivate them to move. And yes, that's as horrifying as it sounds. The soot itself was toxic. Breathing it in led to chronic lung disease, eye inflammation, and what doctors later called soot warts, an early form of scrotal cancer, specific to chimney sweeps. It was the first occupational cancer ever recorded. Congratulations, little Victorian boy. You've just made medical history. The master sweep, villain or victim. Now, not every master sweep was a monster. Some were just poor men trying to survive. But many treated their apprentices like property, beating them, starving them, and working them until they physically couldn't climb anymore. Children slept in basements or sheds, often on soot sacks, their skin permanently blackened, their hair matted, and because they were malnourished, their growth was stunted, making them small enough to keep working longer. Victorian capitalism loved a good paradox. The poorer you are, the more employable you become. Public sympathy, eventually. People did notice, eventually. Reformers like Lord Shaftesbury and Jonas Hanway campaigned against the use of climbing children. Pamphlets circulated, newspapers described the black dwarfs of the city, and moral outrage began to simmer, very slowly, but the sweeps themselves had no voice. Most were illiterate, voiceless, and terrified of their masters. It wasn't until mechanical chimney brushes became popular in the early 1800s that the argument even made sense. Hey, we could just use this tool instead of shoving kids up there. Still, many masters refused. The brushes didn't clean as thoroughly as a human body, apparently. And besides, children were cheaper. The long, slow reform laws did start appearing. The Chimney Sweepers Act of 1788 was the first to set an age limit. A solid 8 years old. Yes, the big reform was, let's not hire under 8s. progress. But enforcement was non-existent. Masters lied, inspectors didn't bother, and life continued much as before. By the 1840s, further laws raised the minimum age, banned apprenticeship abuse, and encouraged mechanical brushes. But again, the practice never really died out until the late 19th century. In rural areas, people still used children well into the 1870s, because, as one old sweep put it, the brushes don't have elbows. It's grimly poetic. In a way, the idea that industrial progress required tiny human elbows to function, the sooty economy, and let's not forget the economics of it all. A chimney sweep could make a decent living in cities. Houses needed cleaning every few weeks during the cold months, and London alone had over 1 million chimneys by 1850. But the real profit came from having apprentices, unpaid labor that cost nothing and worked non-stop. Some masters became wealthy this way. Others, ironically, died of lung disease just like their apprentices. It was a trade that consumed both worker and boss alike, a slow, smoky cannibalism of human lives. The romantic myth now, you might be thinking of the cheerful chimney sweep from Mary Poppins. Yeah, no, that was the sanitized, Disney-fied version. Real chimney sweeps didn't dance on rooftops. They coughed blood, limped, and avoided mirrors because they didn't like seeing their own faces. There was a strange superstition, though. Victorians believed chimney sweeps were lucky, especially at weddings. If you saw one in the street, you were supposed to shake their hand or touch their soot-stained coat for good fortune. It's ironic, considering they were the unluckiest people alive. The tradition apparently comes from an old story about a sweep saving King George II's runaway horse, and the grateful monarch declaring sweeps symbols of good luck. So, next time you see a chimney sweep figurine on a wedding cake, remember, it's basically a soot-covered child with respiratory failure, immortalized as a charm, Chimney Boys Day. Some reformers even organized public holidays for sweeps. Each May, processions of chimney boys would parade through towns, wearing paper hats and ribbons, collecting donations. It was meant as a mix of charity and awareness, but it was also one of the few days they got to see sunlight. They'd sing songs, carry banners, and march behind brass bands. Imagine it. A line of stunted, soot-blackened children dressed in rags and flowers, smiling faintly because for once nobody was shoving them into a chimney. It was tragic and hopeful all at once. A very Victorian mood. The end of the chimney boy. The trade slowly faded as technology improved. By the 1870s, the mechanical brush finally took over, and in 1875, the Chimney Sweepers Act made it illegal to employ children in the industry at all. It only took nearly a century and several thousand sick, stunted kids to make that happen. But hey, better late than never, right? By then, most of the climbing boys had grown up, those who survived, and many had turned to begging or other labor. Their bodies were broken, their lungs ruined, but they'd helped keep Victorian England clean, in a way that cost them everything. So the next time you see a cozy image of a fireplace glowing in a Dickensian Christmas card, just remember, that warm, cheerful chimney might once have been cleaned by a terrified 6-year-old, scraping soot from the inside, praying to see daylight again. Let's ease away from the rooftops now, because while the sweeps were dying of soot, another group of Victorians were busy dying of something far more fashionable: arsenic. Next time, we'll drift into the delicate, deadly world of the Victorian beauty industry, where being pale, perfect, and polished came with a touch of poison. Hey there, still with me? Good. Let's drift out of the chimneys and into something that sounds a little prettier, though, as you'll see, was pretty in the Victorian sense, was often a slow, sparkly form of self-destruction. Because while bakers were feeding people chalk and alum, and chimney sweeps were choking on soot, Society's upper crust was quietly killing itself with arsenic, mercury and lead, all in the name of beauty. Welcome to the toxic Vanity Fair of the 19th century, where the phrase "drop dead" gorgeous was less of a compliment and more of a health warning. The ghostly ideal Victorian beauty. Standards were intense. Pale skin wasn't just fashionable, it was moral. To be pale meant you were refined, delicate, and definitely not working in a field. It was social status painted directly on your face. The ideal woman looked like she'd just recovered from a fainting spell. Translucent skin, blue veins, and maybe a touch of existential despair. Basically, tuberculosis was the beauty template. And if nature hadn't blessed you with the look of someone slowly dying, well, chemistry could help. Arsenic, the complexion. Cure, yes, that arsenic. In the 1800s, it wasn't just for murder mysteries and rat poison. It was an actual beauty supplement. You could buy arsenic wafers, tiny white tablets that promised a pearly complexion. They were marketed as safe, refined arsenic, which is like saying you've developed a mild form of poison. Women and some men would eat them daily, chasing that ethereal glow, and to be fair, it worked. Briefly, arsenic constricted blood vessels, which made skin look pale and smooth. It also slowly destroyed your liver, caused hair loss, and made you vomit violently. But at least you looked fabulous while doing it. There were also arsenic soaps for those who preferred external suffering. They promised to purify the skin, but in practice they just gave you rashes, sores, and sometimes nerve damage. Still, advertisements featured glowing women in white gowns, smiling faintly, because Victorian marketing had a firm "don't ask, don't tell" relationship with reality. Lead. The OG foundation before the arsenic craze, there was lead. Lead-based face creams and powders had been around for centuries, and the Victorians inherited that glamorous death trap proudly. Women applied Venetian cerus, a mix of white lead and vinegar, to whiten their faces. It covered freckles, smoothed wrinkles, and eventually made your skin gray, your teeth fall out, and your face rot from the inside. But at least you didn't look tan. Even men got in on it. A few dandies, the influencers of their time, powdered their faces for that smooth, ghostly finish. If Instagram had existed, half of them would have been sponsored by lead merchants. The green dress of doom lets not forget fashion's contribution to this death parade. In the 1860s, Chile's green, a vibrant, eye-catching pigment made with arsenic trioxide, became all the rage. It was used in dresses, wallpapers, and artificial flowers. A woman walking into a ballroom in a bright green gown would sparkle under the gaslights, but she was basically wearing a toxic cloud. As the fabric rubbed against her skin, arsenic dust was released. Some women developed open sores on their arms and backs, where the fabric touched them. Dressmakers who worked with the pigment every day fared even worse. Constant headaches, coughing, and in some cases, death. There were reports of women collapsing mid-dance, overcome by their own outfits. Fashion, literally, was a killer look. The blushing problem, of course, being too pale, was also suspicious. It made people think you were sick, or worse, working class. So women added a little color back with rouge or lip tints. These were often made with mercury sulfide, better known as vermilion, which caused tremors, emotional instability, and sometimes madness. Yes, crazy from makeup wasn't just a metaphor. Some more affordable products were dyed with red lead instead, because apparently the Victorians didn't believe in non-lethal ingredients. Health was optional. Aesthetics were not. The hair of fair hair also got the chemical treatment. Dyes were made with silver nitrate, mercury, or sulfur, depending on whether you wanted to go dark, light, or bald. Hair tonics promised luscious curls and shine, but often caused chemical burns or bald patches. One popular brand, Macassar oil, became such a household name that Victorians invented antimacassars, little lace covers to protect furniture from it. Because nothing says self-care like ruining your upholstery with toxic grease. And then there were the false hair pieces, wigs and extensions often made from the hair of poor women or corpses. Yes, you could literally wear someone else's scalp to dinner and call it glamour, perfume, powder and poisoned air. The sweet-smelling stuff wasn't safe. Perfumes often use benzene or coal tar derivatives as solvents. Powdered perfumes were sprinkled with orris root, which caused sneezing fits and sometimes allergies severe enough to close your throat. But Victorians didn't have the word allergic. They just called it being delicate. And of course, all these toxic powders and perfumes mixed beautifully with the era's favorite indoor accessory, the gas lamp. Open flames, coal smoke, arsenic dust. The average Victorian parlour was basically a low-budget chemistry experiment in how to die gracefully. Doctors and the double-standard doctors, for their part, were aware that something wasn't quite right. Medical journals occasionally mentioned cosmetic poisoning, but society mostly ignored them. Because who wants to be told that their face cream is melting their nervous system? In a wonderful bit of hypocrisy, men mocked women for using cosmetics, while happily ingesting their own poisons in the form of cigars, opium tonics, and absinthe. Equality, Victorian style. The arsenic glow-up still, the beauty industry thrived. By the late 1800s, chemists had refined arsenic-based products so they didn't kill as quickly. Arsenic complexion lotion, Dr. Campbell's safe arsenic powder, and Rowland's Calidor lined the shelves, each claiming to purify and perfect the skin. A few brave journalists even tested them. One 1870s report described a bottle of face lotion so strong it turned copper coins green. But women kept buying it anyway, because peer pressure, apparently, is stronger than poison. Death by elegance, and yet there was something tragic, almost poetic about it all. The rich spent their fortunes trying to look ethereal. The poor, meanwhile, were dying in factories, trying to make the things that helped the rich look ethereal. Everyone suffered, just in different shades of pale. By the turn of the 20th century, science finally caught up. Safer cosmetics emerged, regulation improved, and arsenic drifted back to its rightful place. In crime novels, not vanities. But the ghostly aesthetic lingered. Even now, that flawless porcelain skin ideal traces its roots back to an era when beauty literally meant fading away. Let's drift onward from the boudoir now, into something even stranger, a Victorian profession that was both morbid and necessary. Because when everyone around you is dying from soot, poison, or cholera, somebody has to clean up. Next time we'll meet the quiet, meticulous souls who worked with the dead, the Victorian undertakers and body snatchers, keepers of dignity in an age of death. Welcome back, Night Wanderer. We've seen bakers poisoning their neighborhoods with flour, chimney sweeps coughing up soot in the name of warmth, and ladies serenely destroying their organs for the sake of beauty. So it feels only natural that we finally end up at the end. Tonight we're heading into the quiet, measured world of the Victorian Undertaker, the people who made death look respectable, because in an age obsessed with mortality, nothing was more alive than the business of dying. The age of the beautiful corpse Victorians had a strange relationship with death. It was everywhere, in their homes, their streets, and their newspapers. But they treated it with the same precision and style they applied to everything else. Dying wasn't just a sad event. It was an occasion. Funerals were status symbols. If your send-off didn't stop traffic, were you even truly loved? The rich competed over who could have the most elaborate mourning carriage, the most horses, the heaviest black drapery. And at the center of it all stood the Undertaker. Part artist, part engineer, part therapist, part salesman. The business of mourning. The Victorian Undertaker was the spiritual descendant of the medieval carpenter, someone who built coffins on request. But by the mid-19th century, that simple trade had exploded into an industry. There were catalogues, price lists, and entire showrooms of funeral goods. You could choose your coffin material, oak, mahogany, or imitation rosewood, your handles, brass, nickel, or gilt, your drapery, and your hearse style, from modest black wagon to full Gothic spectacle with plumes, velvet and glass panels. Undertakers were no longer craftsmen. They were entrepreneurs. And if your family had money, they were also your grief consultants. They'd measure the body, offer condolences, and then immediately start upselling you on the mourning experience. The Victorians adored ceremony. They loved rules. They needed structure even and or especially and in grief, so the Undertaker became an emotional traffic controller, guiding everyone through the theatre of sorrow. Mourning as a lifestyle. When someone died, mourning wasn't just a funeral. It was a season. For widows, it could last 2 years. The first year was deep mourning, requiring full black attire, matte, dull fabrics only. No jewelry, no gloss, just pure grief couture. The second year allowed a little variety, perhaps grey or lavender. The colours of half mourning. Imagine getting to express your emotional recovery in shades of fabric, and the Undertaker provided not just the burial, but also the accessories, mourning clothes, veils, gloves, stationery, ribbons, even black-bordered calling cards. Death had its own fashion economy, and business was booming. The corpse at home before funeral homes existed. Most bodies stayed at home, right in the parlour. The death room was where family and friends came to pay respects, surrounded by candles, flowers, and the faint smell of decay masked by lavender oil. Undertakers helped arrange this, ensuring everything looked serene. If the body began to look less serene, they knew a few tricks. Victorian embalming was still developing, so undertakers often relied on makeup and ice to preserve appearances. Bodies were washed, dressed, and laid out on boards covered with white cloth. Cotton was stuffed under the eyelids and lips to keep the face peaceful. If rigor mortis made the expression too grim, there were ways to soften that too. Nothing a few pins and gentle repositioning couldn't fix. It sounds creepy, but for Victorians it was comforting. Death wasn't hidden. It was part of the household. You could hold the hand of your deceased mother one last time, and then help the undertaker carry her coffin out through the front door, feet first, so she wouldn't look back. The photography of the departed, and then there were the post-mortem photographs, because the Victorians loved a good memento. Photography was expensive, so many families didn't have a single photo of a loved one until after death. The undertaker or a local photographer would position the body in a lifelike pose, sitting in a chair, lying in bed, even surrounded by family who stood stiffly beside them. Sometimes eyes were painted onto the closed eyelids in the final photo. Sometimes the photographer just left the image slightly blurred, as if to suggest the person was merely resting. To modern eyes, it feels macabre. But for Victorians it was love made visible, one last chance to hold on. They displayed those photos in albums alongside the living, because for them the boundary between life and death wasn't a wall. It was more like a veil, thin, ever-present, and stylishly embroidered, the undertaker's toolbox. The tools of the trade were simple but precise, measuring sticks, screwdrivers, embalming syringes, cotton wadding, and endless yards of black crepe. Every undertaker kept a wagon for transport, a stable for horses, and a shed for coffin stock. Some even had display rooms, eerily cheerful parlors where customers could pick their favorite model. The coffin business was surprisingly competitive. Adverts promised airtight preservation, aromatic linings, and even safety coffins, equipped with bells or breathing tubes, just in case you weren't entirely dead. Because yes, Victorians were terrified of premature burial. One inventor even created a coffin with a little flag that would rise above the grave if you moved. In theory, it sounded great. In practice, well, imagine the poor gravedigger seeing a random flag pop up at 2 a.m. The morning economy undertakers worked closely with mourning warehouses, huge emporiums where grieving families could buy everything from black silk to funeral wreaths. Some of these stores were as big as modern department stores, filled with crepe, jet jewelry and stationery with black borders. Death in the Victorian era was as profitable as weddings are today. There were even etiquette books explaining how long to mourn depending on your relationship. A spouse, 2 years. Parent, 6 months to a year. A cousin, 3 months. A goldfish, probably just a sigh. The emotional technician, but beneath all the lace and ceremony, the Undertaker had a strangely modern role. They were therapists before therapy existed. They handled logistics when no one else could think straight. They made grief feel orderly, even beautiful. It's easy to mock the Victorians for their theatrics, but they genuinely believed in giving dignity to the dead. The Undertaker's job was to make sure no one was forgotten, that each departure had form and meaning, even in a world constantly surrounded by loss. When death became a business, by the late 19th century, the funeral trade was fully industrialized. There were embalming schools, professional associations, and trade magazines like the Undertaker's Journal. Mortuary science became a discipline. Death had gone corporate. Middle-class families, eager to imitate the elite, began spending heavily on funerals, even going into debt for them. It wasn't just about mourning anymore. It was about respectability. And so undertakers became status brokers, mediators between love, class, and the great beyond. A quiet legacy. Eventually, the death business moved out of homes and into dedicated funeral parlors. But traces of Victorian ritual remain everywhere. The black hearse, the somber procession, the idea of a good send-off. Modern funerals might look simpler, but they still carry that same undertaker's touch, the quiet choreography of care, the illusion that even death can be managed gracefully. Victorians might have overdone it, they always did, but they gave us one lasting truth. Death, however dreadful, deserves beauty. Let's leave the parlor now soft-footed and walk towards something noisier, the industrial underbelly of the Victorian city. Next time we'll visit the people who kept it running, one dangerous spark at a time. The match girls whose lives lit the lamps of London and whose bones glowed in the dark. The Matchstick Girls glowing in the dark, literally. Hey there again. Still awake? Good, or maybe not good, depending on how much you enjoy hearing about industrial poisoning. Either way, tonight we're floating softly into the world of the Victorian matchstick factory girls, the ones whose faces sometimes glowed in the dark. Which sounds magical, until you realize it wasn't. Let's drift into London, around the 1880s. The air is thick, a little greasy with coal smoke, and the sound of clattering factory doors echoes down narrow brick streets. Inside one of those buildings, usually tucked away near Bow or Whitechapel, you'd find dozens of women, mostly teenagers, sitting at long benches, their fingers coated in white powder. That powder was white phosphorus, and it was about as friendly as a lit match in a fireworks shop. Now matchmaking, as not the romantic kind, was considered honest work for poor women. It was one of the few jobs where you didn't need references, training, or even decent shoes. You just needed hands, lungs, and a willingness to ignore the stinging pain in your jaw after a few months. Because white phosphorus had a nasty habit. It dissolved bone. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. When matches became mass-produced in the early Victorian period, they were the new miracle of convenience. Before that, lighting a fire was this whole process. Flint, tinder, kindling, cursing. But now, you could strike a match on your boot and voila, instant flame. It was progress, modernity, civilization's spark, literally. Unfortunately, that spark came at a cost. The workers who made them. Let's picture a match factory. It's hot, stuffy, and smells a bit like vinegar mixed with death. The girls sat shoulder to shoulder, dipping wooden splints into phosphorus paste, then laying them out to dry. The substance would cling to their skin, coat their hair, and settle in their throats. They'd eat lunch at the benches, too, because there wasn't really a break room or hygiene standards. A few hours into the day, your teeth might ache. Then your gums would start to swell. Then one morning, you'd notice that one side of your jaw had begun to glow faintly at night. A strange, ghostly luminescence that doctors later described as phosphorescence of necrotic bone. The girls called it phossy jaw. Phossy jaw didn't just sound bad. It was bad. The phosphorus caused the jawbone to rot from the inside out, creating abscesses that oozed and stank. The pain was relentless. Some girls lost chunks of their faces, and others died from infections or phosphorus poisoning that spread through the bloodstream. But hey, at least they were told it was part of the job. For factory owners, this was business as usual. They liked white phosphorus because it made matches light easily. Never mind that the fumes turned workers' bones to mush. The girls were replaceable, after all. Victorian capitalism had plenty more where they came from. Still, the glowing jaws did cause a bit of a stir. Imagine walking through the slums at night and spotting a faintly illuminated face peering out of a window. A ghostly girl who wasn't dead yet. It made for good gossip in pubs. And for doctors, it was almost a novelty disease. Some even collected jaw specimens for study. But the workers themselves, they mostly kept working. They had families to feed, rent to pay. A girl might hide the smell by chewing mint leaves or keeping her mouth closed. Some wrapped their jaws in scarves claiming toothache. Others were dismissed the moment symptoms appeared, because, of course, sick girls made customers uneasy. Then came Bryant and May, one of the largest match companies in London. Their name sounds respectable, like gentlemen who'd host a fine dinner party. In reality, they oversaw one of the worst factories in the city. Long hours, low pay, and constant exposure to phosphorus dust. In 1888, things finally started to change, not because of the government, but because of a newspaper article. Enter Annie Besant, a social reformer, who was basically the Victorian equivalent of a viral whistleblower. She visited the factory, talked to the workers, and published an exposé titled "White Slavery in London." It was fiery, ironically, and it spread like one. People were horrified to learn that the cheap matches they used daily came from girls whose bones were literally melting away. The match girls had had enough. They went on strike, one of the first organized industrial strikes led entirely by women. Hundreds of them walked out, demanding better pay and safer conditions. They even formed the Match Girls Union, which was, in Victorian terms, almost scandalous. Young working-class women speaking up for themselves. Society didn't know what to do with that. Against all odds, the strike worked. Public pressure mounted, and eventually Bryant and May had to cave. The use of white phosphorus began to decline, replaced by the safer red phosphorus, which didn't glow, didn't rot your bones, and didn't make headlines for all the wrong reasons. By the early 1900s, governments across Europe finally banned white phosphorus matches altogether. A small mercy, decades too late. The surviving match girls didn't exactly live happily ever after. Most faded back into obscurity, returning to domestic service or factory work. But their protest left a small glowing mark on labor history, the same way their jaws once did, except this time it was symbolic. There's something eerily poetic about it, isn't there? These girls, covered in luminous dust, working themselves sick to light the fires that others would warm their homes by. It's the sort of metaphor Victorians probably loved, suffering in the name of progress. So next time you strike a match, maybe take a quiet second to remember that someone once paid for that simple spark with their smile, or their jaw. Now, before you drift too far into the dark, let's float gently over to another occupation, one that sounds charming at first, but might just be mad enough to rival them. Hey again. Still drifting? Perfect. Because tonight, we're stepping softly into a world that smells faintly of wet felt, pipe smoke, and just a little madness. Welcome to the Victorian hat-making industry, where elegance met insanity, and everyone politely pretended not to notice. Let's start with a picture. A tidy little hat workshop somewhere in London, maybe around 1850. The air's thick, damp, and vaguely metallic. On wooden benches sit rows of men, some coughing, some mumbling, some humming to themselves as they shape fine beaver felt into glossy top hats. It's a respectable trade. Customers were gentlemen. The profits were good. The side effects, well, less ideal. You've probably heard the phrase mad as a hatter. Most people think of Alice in Wonderland, with Lewis Carroll's jittery tea-obsessed character, waving his teacup around like he's one blink away from implosion. But Carroll didn't invent the madness. He just borrowed it from real life. See, hatmakers in the 18th and 19th centuries used mercury nitrate to turn fur into felt. Beaver fur, rabbit fur, whatever your social rank required. Mercury made the fibers soft, easy to shape, and beautifully smooth. But it also had this fun little habit of vaporizing when heated, which, coincidentally, hatmakers did all day long. Every time they steamed or ironed a hat, they inhaled mercury fumes. Day after day, year after year, and slowly, quietly, it began to eat away at their nervous systems. The symptoms came on gradually. A tremor in the hands, a bit of irritability, maybe some confusion or blurred vision. Then it got worse. Shaking, memory loss, drooling, depression, hallucinations, uncontrollable twitching. They called it hatter's shakes. Doctors, when they finally noticed, called it mercurial tremor. The hatters themselves just called it Tuesday, and yet they kept working. Because what else could they do? A man in a small town might have spent 20 years learning to make hats. His father had probably done it before him. The idea of giving it up because of a few shakes was absurd. Besides, the alternative was starvation. The tragedy was everyone sort of knew mercury was bad. As early as the 1700s, physicians had pointed out the connection between hatters and nervous disorders. They'd seen the same symptoms in mirror makers who used mercury to coat glass. But Victorian logic being what it was, they shrugged and carried on. A bit of madness builds character, apparently. By the 1800s, the average hatter was basically marinating in mercury vapor for 12 hours a day. Some factories had poor ventilation, others none at all. You could practically taste the metal in the air. Men went home with trembling fingers, stuttering speech, and a strange kind of anxious energy. And it wasn't just physical. Mercury had a way of breaking the mind from the inside out. Contemporary accounts describe hatters bursting into laughter at inappropriate moments, forgetting simple tasks, or growing paranoid and withdrawn. Some became violent. Others fell into deep melancholia. One factory inspector noted that long-term hatters often had a peculiar expression of eye and twitch of mouth, as if their own faces were rebelling against them, and yet they made beautiful hats. The irony writes itself. Imagine this: an elegant gentleman in the 1850s tipping his shining silk top hat as he enters the opera. That hat, immaculate, perfectly shaped, was probably made by a man who couldn't button his own shirt anymore. or remember his name by the time he turned 40. The most famous Mad Hatter outbreak happened in Danbury, Connecticut in the United States. By the late 19th century, Danbury was basically Hat City, USA. It produced almost a quarter of all American hats. And with that came the inevitable: Danbury shakes. Mercury nitrate was cheap. It made great felt. Profit came first, as always. It wasn't until the 1940s, yes, 1940s, that mercury was finally banned from hat making in the US. Britain had begun phasing it out earlier. But by then, generations of workers had already been poisoned. If you're wondering how no one intervened sooner, remember, this was the same society that let match girls' faces rot off before calling it unsafe. The Victorians were masters at ignoring slow deaths, especially when they were tidy, quiet, and profitable. And, because the universe loves irony, Lewis Carroll's Mad Hatter was published right in the middle of it all. Carroll didn't intend him as a Mercury victim, but readers recognized the twitching, babbling eccentric immediately. The phrase "mad as a hatter" had been around for decades, and by the time the book appeared in 1865, everyone knew exactly what it meant. Of course, Victorians laughed about it. Madness made good entertainment, but behind that literary joke was an entire workforce slowly unraveling, one nervous system at a time. There's a strange poetry in it, though. The hats were symbols of status, civility, reason, the final touch of a gentleman. And they were made by men who were losing all three. By the late 19th century, some doctors began suggesting new methods, using hydrogen peroxide or sulfur instead of mercury, but old habits died hard. Many small shops couldn't afford to modernize. Mercury stayed on like a ghost in the glue. Eventually, public health campaigns took hold, and protective equipment was introduced. But the damage was generational. Entire communities of hatters developed neurological disorders that lingered long after the last mercury bath had been poured out. You can almost imagine one of them, sitting by a dim lamp at the end of the day, hands shaking too much to hold a teacup, watching the flicker of the flame, wondering if it was all worth it. The hats were beautiful, the men not so much. And that's the thing about Victorian progress. Every shining new symbol of refinement, the clean shirt, the polished shoe, the felt hat, hid a small tragedy underneath. Someone paid the price so that someone else could look respectable. So when you see the Mad Hatter smiling through his nonsense at a tea table, remember, he wasn't just whimsical. He was historically accurate. And with that, let's gently drift toward our next story, because the Victorians had a whole cabinet of chemical nightmares. Up next, we'll meet the women who worked in radium factories. They thought they were painting light into the world. They were, in fact, painting their own deaths. But for now, take a slow breath and picture that hat, perfectly shaped, gleaming in the lamplight, made by hands that trembled like the flame itself. Sleepy yet? Good, because the next glow we'll see is radioactive. Welcome back. Let's stay in that same dim industrial haze for a moment, because we're moving from mercury madness to something that quite literally glowed in the dark. Tonight, we're meeting the Radium Girls, women who worked in early 20th century factories painting watch dials with luminous paint. It was the job that sparkled, the job that killed beautifully. So imagine it's around 1917. The Great War is raging and time suddenly matters a lot. Soldiers need watches that glow in the trenches at night. Pocket watches are too clunky, and electric lamps are too slow. What you need is a dial that shines softly in the dark, and that's where radium paint came in. Radium was new. It was exciting. It was glamorous. Discovered by Marie and Pierre Curie just a few decades earlier, it was hailed as the miracle element, glowing proof of progress. People added it to toothpaste, face cream, chocolate, even tonics that promised to rejuvenate the blood, because nothing says vitality like mild radioactive decay. So when young women were hired to paint tiny watch dials with radium-based paint, it sounded like a dream job. It was clean, light work. You got to sit at a bench in a well-lit studio instead of a smoky factory. You were making something patriotic. And, best of all, you glowed. Literally. After a long day, the girls would notice their hands shining faintly in the dark. Their clothes shimmered. Some would paint their nails, their teeth, or dab a bit of radium on their cheeks before heading home. They thought it was charming, like fairy dust. But what they didn't know was that radium, for all its soft elegance, was eating them alive from the inside. The painting technique was called lip pointing. The brushes were thin and delicate, and the factory owners didn't want to waste paint by cleaning them in water. So the girls were told to lick the bristles into a fine point before each stroke. Hundreds of times a day, every time they swallowed a little bit of radium. At first there were no signs. Just a faint taste of metal, a small glow, a little jaw ache maybe. But months later the symptoms began. Teeth loosened, gums bled. Bones began to ache, especially in the jaw and hips. Doctors were baffled. Some thought it was rheumatism. Others blamed poor hygiene. Then came the fractures, bones shattering spontaneously. The jawbone would crumble, literally disintegrate, and sometimes it could be lifted out by hand. They called it radium jaw. Sound familiar? The Victorians would have recognized it instantly. The Match Girls had walked this road a generation earlier, but radium poisoning was worse. The element didn't just corrode tissue, it replaced calcium in the bones. Once inside, it stayed there, forever ticking away. The girls' skeletons became radioactive. Their bodies literally became light sources. In the dark, their mouths would glow faintly. Their coffins would later too. The companies, of course, denied everything. The most infamous was the United States Radium Corporation in New Jersey, along with a few sister factories in Illinois and Connecticut. When the girls began falling ill, management blamed syphilis, because why not humiliate the victims along the way? But one by one, the women started fighting back. One of them, Grace Fryer, became the quiet heart of the resistance. She'd been a dial painter since her teens, but when her jaw began to crumble, she went from doctor to doctor trying to prove the connection. It took her years to find someone willing to listen, because no one wanted to take on a powerful war contractor. By 1927, she and 4 other women sued the company. The newspapers dubbed them the Radium Girls. Their lawsuit became a landmark case in labor history, though it came too late to save most of them. During the trial, the women were so weak, they couldn't raise their hands to take the oath. They were given chairs in court. One had to testify lying down. The defense naturally stalled, hoping the women would die before the verdict. And they almost did. But the story caught public attention. It was morbidly fascinating. Young, glowing women wasting away like candle flames. Journalists loved the imagery. For once, the world paid attention to factory girls. Eventually, the Radium Girls won. Barely. The settlement was meager, a few $1,000s each and lifelong medical coverage, but the precedent was huge. It forced new workplace safety laws and gave birth to modern occupational health standards. And yet, the story didn't end there. The radium stayed. Decades later, scientists found the girls' graves still radioactive. Their bones emitted faint light on Geiger counters. The element they had brushed so delicately onto watch faces was still inside them, glowing softly in eternal irony. It's haunting, isn't it? The idea that something could be so beautiful and so deadly at the same time. The Victorians would have approved. It's tragedy wrapped in elegance, science fused with suffering, and, in a strange way, The Radium Girls were the last echo of that 19th century world we've been drifting through, a world where progress always seemed to come with a quiet funeral attached. So as we dim the lights a bit more, let's step away from the factories and into another realm of gentle ruin, one that's less about chemicals and more about vanity. Next, we'll meet the women who painted their faces with poison for beauty, because if you were rich enough in the 1800s, you could afford to die fashionably. Welcome back, dreamers. Let's dim the gaslight a little more and move away from the factories. Because death wasn't only an occupational hazard in the Victorian world, it was also a fashion statement. Tonight's story is about beauty. Specifically, the kind of beauty that kills you slowly while everyone compliments your complexion. Let's float gently into the late 1800s, the age of corsets, curls, and candles, of fainting couches and polite small talk about the weather. If you were a respectable lady, or someone aspiring to be one, your skin was supposed to look as pale as moonlight. Freckles, unacceptable. Tanned skin? Practically scandalous. It meant you worked outdoors, and heaven forbid anyone confuse you with the working class. So the quest for paleness became an obsession. And the easiest way to achieve that ethereal look? Lead had been part of the beauty industry since Roman times. Even Queen Elizabeth I was a fan. She used something called Venetian ceruse, a thick paste of lead carbonate mixed with vinegar. It went on smooth, gave a lovely white finish, and conveniently covered scars from smallpox. Unfortunately, it also absorbed through the skin, entered the bloodstream, and slowly poisoned you. Victorian women revived that ancient recipe with enthusiasm. A soft, ghostly pallor was the height of elegance. If it made you dizzy, forgetful, or prone to fainting, well, that was just part of being delicate. You could buy jars of lead-based face powder from any good apothecary. It was often labeled as pearl white, lily complexion, or my personal favorite, the enamel of youth, which is ironic, since it stripped the skin like paint thinner. After a few months of use, your face would start to peel. Lips turned blue. Hair fell out. Teeth loosened. But still the compliments kept coming. My, what lovely porcelain skin you have. Porcelain was, in fact, the correct word. You were literally glazing yourself. Some women took it further. They applied arsenic wafers, tiny white discs you could swallow to purify the blood. The packaging promised radiance, calm nerves, and eternal youth. The reality was nausea, hair loss, and peripheral neuropathy. But beauty demands sacrifice, and apparently sanity was optional. Men weren't entirely innocent in this either. Some used arsenic tonics to maintain vigorous health, and that fashionable pale aesthetic. One particularly charming product called Fowler's Solution was marketed as a cure-all. Nerves, complexion, digestion, take your pick. Its main ingredient? Arsenic trioxide, the same compound used to kill rats. The upper classes adored the stuff. Nothing said refinement like sipping poison from a crystal decanter before bed. But here's where it gets worse, or funnier, depending on your tolerance for grim irony. Many of these deadly cosmetics were advertised as safe alternatives to older, more dangerous recipes. So if lead cream was bad for you, try arsenic lotion instead. It's modern. And then came the green dresses. Ah yes, the infamous arsenic green. Around the 1860s, bright green fabric was all the rage. It was vivid, eye-catching, and looked gorgeous under candlelight. The pigment, Shields green or Paris green, was made with copper arsenite, the same chemical used in rat poison and insecticides. Dressmakers, seamstresses, and factory workers who handled the dye suffered constant headaches, rashes, and breathing problems. Some literally died from handling too many yards of it, but upper-class ladies loved it. One journalist called it the color of envy, though it might as well have been the color of death. There are reports of women fainting at balls, overcome by the heat and the faint vapor of arsenic, rising from their own gowns. Some had ulcers on their arms and necks, where the fabric rubbed their skin, and yet the dresses kept selling. Because beauty, like empire, required casualties. By the 1870s, scientists finally began to connect the dots. Public health officers issued warnings, but fashion rarely listens to science. It wasn't until synthetic dyes arrived that arsenic finally went out of style. Still, the damage lingered. The ideal of fragile, sickly beauty didn't fade overnight. Even after arsenic creams disappeared from shop shelves, women continued to chase that faint, ghostly look through diet pills, vinegar tonics, and later, in the 1920s, early versions of radioactive face powder. Because apparently we never learn. There's a curious parallel here between the Match Girls, the Hatters, and these powdered aristocrats. All of them, in their own way, were victims of the same illusion, that progress, beauty, and refinement were worth the price of pain. That suffering could be sanitized with lace and perfume. If you were poor, you inhaled poison to make matches. If you were rich, you rubbed it on your face. Different ends of the same candle, burning just as quietly. But there's one more group we need to visit tonight. A set of men whose job was, quite literally, to die for fashion. The tailors, the milliners, and the feather workers of the late Victorian period, who turned birds into baubles and fur into dreams. Let's float softly toward them next. Because if the Victorian obsession with beauty was deadly, the obsession with elegance was, well, even worse. Welcome to the world of feathers, fur, and fashion. The century when elegance was measured not in taste, but in trophies. Let's start with the feathers. In the late 1800s, hats were everything. A woman's hat wasn't just a fashion accessory. It was an identity. The bigger, the better. The more elaborate, the more enviable. Feathers became the ultimate symbol of refinement, and not just any feathers. We're talking entire birds. Egret plumes were the most prized of all. Those long, delicate, snow-white feathers that shimmered faintly in the light. They came from birds nesting in the wetlands of Florida, the Caribbean, and South America. Harvesting them wasn't exactly gentle work. Hunters would wait until breeding season, when the feathers were at their fullest. Then they'd shoot the adult birds straight off their nests, leaving chicks to die below. For every pound of egret feathers, thousands of birds were slaughtered. The swamps ran red, but the milliners' windows gleamed white. And that wasn't even the worst of it. Victorian fashion also adored birds of paradise, hummingbirds, kingfishers, each one mounted, lacquered, and pinned into hats like a macabre still life. A single fashionable lady in London might wear the entire ecosystem of a tropical forest on her head. There's a famous description from a naturalist in 1887 who said, "You may know the species of a continent by walking down Regent Street." He wasn't exaggerating. By the 1890s, the global feather trade had become one of the most profitable and ecologically catastrophic industries in the British Empire. Ships arrived in London carrying crates full of plumes and bird carcasses. The numbers are staggering, millions of birds a year, also that ladies could look just a bit more angelic. And behind those angelic hats, an army of silent women, the milliners. They were the ones who cleaned, dyed, wired, and shaped the feathers into fashionable creations. They worked in cramped workshops, handling arsenic-treated plumes to preserve their color, breathing in dust and dyes. Their fingers grew raw, their eyes strained from the fine stitching. Many were young girls, paid almost nothing. Sound familiar? It's the Match Girls all over again. Except this time the poison was wrapped in silk. Some milliners slept at their work tables, using scraps of velvet as pillows. They inhaled mercury from felt stiffeners, glue vapors from hat frames, and arsenic dust from the feathers. If the feathers were dyed green, well, we already know what that meant. The irony is that these women, who could never afford a fashionable hat themselves, were literally dying to make them for others. And let's not forget the fur. By the 19th century, the global demand for fur had reached obscene levels. Beaver, sable, mink, ermine all became currency in the upper echelons of society. Coats were lined with fur, collars trimmed with it, even muffs and stoles made of entire animals, heads and paws included. Men wore fur too. A gentleman's winter coat was incomplete without a fur collar or lining. It was a symbol of power, wealth, and masculinity, but the trapping industry behind it was brutal. Indigenous hunters in North America were coerced into trade systems that depleted wildlife and destroyed local ecosystems. Trappers lost fingers to frostbite, drowned breaking through ice, or froze in the pursuit of pelts that would end up in London shop windows. By the 1880s, critics began to notice. The early animal welfare movement took root, led primarily by women who had grown disgusted with what their own wardrobes represented. They founded organizations like the Plumage League and the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, RSPB, which started as a protest group against feathered hats. One of their slogans was painfully simple: "Women wear the birds, and men kill them." And yet change came slowly. The fashion magazines still praised heavenly adornments and creations of the air. Society ladies argued that bird hats were art. Hunters claimed they were providing livelihoods. Manufacturers insisted the birds weren't really endangered. It's the same circular logic every industry uses right before everything collapses. Still, those quiet protests did something remarkable. For the first time, people began connecting beauty with morality. The Victorians started asking, is elegance worth extinction? The answer, of course, was complicated. The industry didn't vanish overnight. The feather trade continued well into the early 20th century. But that moral crack widened over time. By the 1910s, the sight of women wearing dead birds on their heads began to seem grotesque rather than glamorous. Fashion shifted. Feathers gave way to silk, flowers, lace, and ribbons. And behind that change, hidden beneath all the lace and propriety, was a quiet revolution. A shift in conscience. Because maybe, just maybe, civilization had finally grown tired of killing beauty to look beautiful. The story of Victorian fashion isn't just about vanity. It's about the illusion of control. Humans wanted to dominate nature, wear it, display it, become it. But in doing so, they destroyed the very thing they worshipped. The feathers rotted. The fur faded. The poisons left scars that no powder could hide. And all the while, history watched silently, like a taxidermist preserving the past for display. Next time we'll visit one final chapter in this gallery of elegant horrors. The people who made beauty possible, not through fashion but through color. Because while the Victorians wore death on their heads and faces, the artists of the 19th century painted it on their walls. All right. Lights dimmed, tea cooling beside the bed. Let's slip into one last poisoned corner of the Victorian world. This one isn't about jobs. It's about home. Because for all their industrial brilliance, the Victorians managed to turn their own houses into slow-motion death traps, and they did it in the name of beauty. Picture it, London, 1850s. Gas lamps hum. Coal smoke floats through the fog. You step into a drawing room and it's stunning. Walls papered in deep green vines and golden scrolls. The fashionable new design from William Morris himself, the darling of the arts and crafts movement. It looks lush, fresh, natural. It also happens to be covered in arsenic. Yes, that lovely green wallpaper was made with copper arsenite, the same chemical we met earlier in the baker's flour and the seamstress's dresses. It was nicknamed Shields Green or Paris Green, and for a few glorious decades it was the absolute height of interior fashion. People loved it. They called it the color of life. The irony could not be louder. Shields green gave a brilliant, almost glowing hue, the kind of green that seemed alive, especially in candlelight. It covered wallpapers, curtains, and even children's toys. Victorian homes were drenched in it, and every inch was slowly releasing arsenic dust into the air. You didn't have to lick the walls to get poisoned, though some children apparently did. It happened just by living there. Heat, moisture, and time caused microscopic flakes of arsenic-laced pigment to drift off and settle on skin. Furniture and lungs. Symptoms crept in quietly. Fatigue, stomach pain, nausea, strange skin sores, and that ever-charming greenish pallor. People lost hair. They wasted away. Doctors diagnosed summer fevers and miasmas or female weakness. No one suspected the wallpaper. Why would they? The house looked so perfect. One story that made headlines in the 1860s tells of a young woman who fell mysteriously ill every time she visited her bedroom. Doctors were puzzled, until someone finally scraped off the wallpaper and sent it to a chemist. He found enough arsenic to kill a dozen people. Even more disturbing was what happened when a damp house was warmed by fire or gaslight. The heat could react with the glue and mold on the wallpaper, converting arsenic into arsine gas, an invisible, garlic-scented vapor that was as lethal as it was undetectable. Imagine hosting a dinner party and slowly poisoning your guests with your impeccable taste. There's something almost poetic about it. The Victorian obsession with beauty, refinement, and luxury literally suffocated them in their sleep. Manufacturers, of course, denied everything. When the first chemists began raising alarms, pointing out that their products might be toxic, wallpaper makers fought back hard. It's perfectly harmless, they insisted. If people are getting sick, it's probably bad air. William Morris, the designer whose wallpapers graced countless elegant homes, was particularly defensive. His family owned an arsenic mine, which didn't help his credibility. When critics accused him of using poison in his patents, he shrugged it off as an absurd scare. "I believe arsenic is perfectly harmless," he said. Spoiler, it wasn't. By the 1870s, public health officials finally began connecting the dots. Reports surfaced of entire families falling ill, pets dying mysteriously, and wallpaper factory workers wasting away. One paper famously declared, "The walls have death upon them." But change was slow. Removing arsenic meant duller colors, higher costs, and admitting that fashion had gone too far. And the Victorians weren't great at admitting things. Even as late as the 1890s, people were still hanging toxic wallpaper. The wealthy simply bought improved arsenic-free patterns, though many of those turned out to still contain traces of the chemical. The poor living in damp, overcrowded houses continued breathing it daily. There's a strange, quiet horror to that image. A family huddled by the fire, surrounded by beautiful green walls, slowly inhaling their own decor. And yet, this wasn't the only household killer. Victorian homes were full of hazards. Carpets dyed with lead, curtains coated in mercury-based pigments, toys painted with chromium yellow. Even baby cribs had arsenic lace or lead paint. The nursery was in many cases a toxic wonderland. One chemist in 1883 wrote that there is scarcely an article in the domestic household that is not impregnated with some form of poison. So, if the wallpaper didn't get you, the drapes probably would. But why stop there? The Victorians also loved new gadgets, things that promised convenience and progress. Gaslighting was one of them. It filled homes with soft, warm glow, but it also filled them with carbon monoxide. Countless people died quietly, mistaken for having fallen asleep in their chair. Even the plumbing wasn't safe. Lead pipes ensured that clean water stayed deliciously toxic. It's hard not to admire their consistency. The Victorians managed to poison themselves from every possible angle: air, water, walls, and wardrobe. And all the while, they thought they were living in the pinnacle of modern civilization. It's almost comforting in a dark way. We're not so different today. Every generation thinks its comforts are safe. Every age has its invisible toxins, just with better marketing. Eventually, science caught up. By the early 1900s, arsenic pigments were phased out, replaced by synthetic dyes. Wallpaper makers rebranded, shifting towards sanitary designs with clean patterns and washable surfaces. The aesthetic changed too. Heavy Victorian interiors gave way to the pale, airy minimalism of the Edwardians, a literal breath of fresh air after decades of suffocating luxury. But the story of the poisoned room lingers as one of history's gentlest horrors. There were no screams, no crime, no villain, just beauty quietly killing, and perhaps that's why it fascinates us so much today. We like to imagine danger as something loud, dramatic, and far away. But for the Victorians, it was woven into their curtains, mixed into their paint, brushed onto their walls. The danger was domestic, pretty, and perfectly normal. So, as we close the book on this long, drowsy exploration of the deadly jobs and beautiful poisons of the 19th century, let's remember that progress, for all its marvels, has always come with a fine print. The bakers who sifted arsenic flour, the seamstresses breathing dye dust, the match girls glowing in the dark, the hatters humming through Mercury fog, the milliners stitching plumes from dead birds, and finally the families, sleeping peacefully beneath green wallpaper. All of them believed they were living in a brighter, more civilized world. And in a way, they were, just not for long, so close your eyes now. Let the candlelight fade, and dream of a century that made death fashionable. And that, my friend, brings us gently to the end of tonight's long, toxic lullaby. If you're still awake, congratulations. You've just survived a full tour through Victorian workplaces, fashion trends and living rooms that were, quite literally, trying to kill everyone involved. From the baker kneading arsenic dough, to the hatter humming along in mercury fumes, to the poor housemaid sweeping up flakes of green wallpaper, the 19th century really was the golden age of accidental self-destruction. It's funny to think about, isn't it? We picture the Victorians as buttoned-up moralists, prim, proper, obsessed with manners and hygiene, yet they lived surrounded by death dust, eating chemicals and decorating with poison. And through it all, they thought it was progress. There's something very human about that. Our endless need to improve the world, even if it means quietly poisoning ourselves along the way. So maybe when you lie down tonight, in your mercifully arsenic-free bed, take a small breath of gratitude for modern safety standards. Your bread won't kill you, your hat won't whisper hallucinations, and your wallpaper probably won't give you liver failure. Probably. And if you find yourself staring at your ceiling, drifting in and out of sleep, remember this: every era has its poisons. The Victorians just made theirs prettier. Thank you for listening, for staying awake, or for falling asleep somewhere in the middle. Either way, you did it right. I'll see you next time. Same quiet voice, same dim light, same slightly absurd corner of history. Until then, sleep well. Or at least, try to... Let's stay in the 19th century just a little longer. The factories are still smoking outside. The wallpaper is still faintly glowing, and the air still smells like coal, perfume, and maybe grief. Because tonight we're talking about how the Victorians made death beautiful. Now, the Victorians didn't just mourn, they performed mourning. They wrapped grief in etiquette, stitched it into black silk, and wore it like a second skin. And at the center of it all was Queen Victoria herself, the original influencer of sorrow. When her husband Prince Albert died in 1861, she descended into what can only be described as a lifetime mood. She wore black for the rest of her days, 40 long years. She ordered his rooms preserved exactly as they were, meals set for him daily, and his clothes laid out each morning. It wasn't just mourning. It was devotion turned ritual turned national trend. Soon Britain followed suit. Black became the color of respectability, and mourning became an industry. There were mourning warehouses, mourning photographers, mourning dressmakers, mourning jewelry shops, and even etiquette manuals dedicated to explaining how long you should grieve, depending on who had the misfortune to die. For a husband, 2 years minimum. For a parent, 12 months. For a cousin, maybe 6 weeks if you actually liked them. And yes, there were rules about what shade of black was appropriate for each stage of sorrow. Shiny jet black was for fresh grief. Later, as your heart supposedly began to heal, you graduated to duller fabrics like crepe or mauve. Half mourning, as it was called. It was a whole emotional dress code, except no one dared be underdressed. But mourning wasn't just about clothes. It was about display. The Victorians loved a visual reminder of mortality. The beautiful, the tragic, and the slightly uncanny. That's where mourning jewelry came in. You might imagine a locket containing a lock of hair. Sweet, right? Except imagine an entire necklace made of tightly woven human hair, or a brooch framed with the curls of someone long gone, twisted into a floral motif under glass. It sounds eerie now, but back then, it was sentimental, a way to keep your loved one literally close to your heart. Some families even sent hair to specialized workshops where women crafted elaborate designs from it. Bracelets, watch chains, even wreaths that spelled out names or prayers. The more intricate the pattern, the deeper the devotion. It was, in its own way, the Victorian version of a memorial tattoo, intimate, permanent, and very personal. But perhaps the most haunting part of all was mourning photography. In the early days of photography, around the 1840s and 50s, the technology was slow, expensive, and exclusive. Sitting for a photograph was a serious affair. People held still for minutes at a time under blinding light, which meant that for many families, the first time they could afford a photograph was also the last time they'd ever see a loved one. Thus, the post-mortem portrait was born. The dead were posed as if sleeping, reading or simply gazing peacefully into the distance. Sometimes they were surrounded by family, stiff and solemn beside them. The photographers would touch up the eyes with tiny dots of paint, making them seem eerily alive. In some photos, you can't even tell who's dead. Everyone looks equally motionless. Parents posed with their lost children, siblings with their deceased brothers or sisters. Babies were cradled by mothers in black lace, the stillness of the child captured forever. It wasn't considered grotesque. It was an act of love, a photograph for remembrance when remembrance was all that was left. But if you look at those images now, there's something profoundly quiet about them. They're not about shock. They're about acceptance. A recognition that death was part of daily life. The Victorians didn't hide from it. They decorated it, dressed it, and sometimes I even smiled through it. Funerals, too, became spectacles of sorrow. Professional mourners could be hired to follow the hearse, crying convincingly for a fee. Black horses with feathered plumes pulled glass carriages bearing the coffin draped in velvet. Entire neighborhoods would stop to watch as the procession passed, an unspoken community theater of mortality. For the wealthy, the goal was grandeur, elaborate tombs, sculpted angels, carved epitaphs full of poetic despair. For the poor, it was about respect, a proper burial even if the coffin was rented by the day. Yes, rented. Many working-class families couldn't afford to buy a coffin, so they paid to borrow one for the funeral. The body would be displayed in the rental, then buried in a simple pine box. Because dignity was a luxury, but appearance was everything. And all of this, the fashion, the jewelry, the photography, the funeral theatre, came together to form what we now call the cult of mourning. It was both sincere and performative, a strange, elegant attempt to control grief by turning it into ritual. You couldn't stop death, but you could make it beautiful. Of course, not everyone approved. Some critics argued that this obsession with mourning blurred the line between remembrance and morbidity. But maybe that was the point. In an era where death was constant, from disease, childbirth, and industrial accidents, the Victorians learned to live alongside it. They didn't push it away like we do now. They invited it to tea. And as odd as it seems, there's something almost comforting in that, because to the Victorians, mourning wasn't just about loss. It was proof that love had existed, and that in some way it still did. Let's keep the candles burning a little longer. The mourning dresses are still hanging in the wardrobe. The mirrors are still covered in black crepe. And the doorbell, it's probably another salesman, because grief in Victorian England wasn't just an emotion. It was a market. Welcome to the death industry. By the 1870s, dying had become a full-time business venture. There were undertakers, coffin makers, embalmers, grave decorators, photographers, florists, hearse renters, and even etiquette advisors to tell you how to die properly. If you were wealthy, your passing could easily employ a dozen people, all determined to make sure you left the world looking appropriately tragic. Let's start with the undertakers. Once upon a time, they were just carpenters who made coffins on the side. But as the Victorian era progressed, death became so wrapped up in class image and social performance that simple carpentry no longer sufficed. Now, undertakers were expected to manage the entire show. They arranged the procession, the pallbearers, the floral arches, the carriages, and even the mourning stationery. Thick black bordered cards announcing one's untimely but stylish demise. The best undertakers in London were like wedding planners for the afterlife. Their catalogues offered everything from economical funerals to aristocratic memorial services. For the right price, you could even rent a full team of professional mourners, weeping women in heavy veils, trained to sob in perfect rhythm beside the coffin. Think of them as emotional extras, paid by the tier. Then there were the coffin makers. Victorian coffins were far from simple boxes. They were crafted from mahogany, oak, or walnut, lined with velvet and fitted with brass handles. Some even featured glass panels, so the deceased could be admired one last time, as if in a final display window of mortality. For the elite, coffins could be personalized with monograms, coats of arms, or biblical carvings. Others included built-in compartments for keepsakes, a lock of hair, a love letter, or a bit of jewelry to carry into eternity. Of course, for the working class, options were slimmer. Pine coffins were standard, rented if necessary, and reused if you couldn't pay in full. Undertakers often had burial packages, scaling from respectable to superior. Death had gone retail, and because Victorian society loved innovation, even in its most morbid corners, the industry embraced new technology. The mid-1800s saw the rise of embalming, imported from America after the Civil War, where it had been used to preserve fallen soldiers for transport home. By the 1880s, British undertakers offered embalming as a premium service, promising a lifelike appearance for days, even weeks. Chemicals like arsenic again, zinc chloride and formaldehyde were injected into the body. The goal was simple: to make death look restful, almost artistic. In large towns, embalming institutes opened to trained professionals. Their advertisements were strangely cheerful. Preserve your loved ones with dignity and skill. one pamphlet declared. But embalming wasn't cheap. And where there's profit, there's always someone willing to cut corners. Some undertakers diluted their fluids, or skipped them entirely, relying on makeup, ice, and sheer optimism to keep the deceased looking presentable. Others were accused of reusing coffins or substituting cheaper materials, scandals that occasionally reached the newspapers under headlines like "The Coffin Swindle." Even in death, you couldn't quite trust capitalism. The funeral carriage, and another Victorian obsession, became an icon of respectability. The most fashionable were horse-drawn hearses made of black glass and polished ebony, decorated with silver filigree and massive feathered plumes. The horses themselves were chosen for their color, always black, always solemn, with matching plumes on their heads. In fact, a good undertaker's stable could be more impressive than his workshop. The number of horses pulling your hearse became an instant symbol of class. 2 horses was respectable. 4 was ideal. 6? That was aristocracy. For the family following behind, mourning carriages could be rented by the hour. Prices were often listed right next to the coffin options, as if one were choosing dessert pairings. And let's not forget the florists. Floral arrangements were language in themselves. Crosses, hearts, wreaths, anchors, all loaded with sentimental meaning. A broken column symbolized a life cut short. Ivy meant eternal love. Lilies were purity. Roses were remembrance. Funeral flowers became so elaborate that magazines published guides for floral tributes of good taste. It was considered poor form to send anything too small or too cheerful. Meanwhile, mourning photographers stayed busy. Families posed beside coffins or with memorial portraits draped in black ribbon. For a price, photographers offered hand-tinted prints, where the deceased was given a gentle blush and softly painted lips, a final illusion of life. There was even a booming trade in mourning stationery. Cards, envelopes and invitations edged in thick black borders were used to announce deaths and send condolences. A thin border meant distant relation. A heavy one meant tragedy up close. You could practically measure grief in ink thickness. The upper classes took all this to spectacular extremes. When the Duke of Wellington died in 1852, his funeral procession stretched for miles. Thousands of soldiers, plumed horses, and black-draped carriages rolling through London in funereal perfection. But even the middle and working classes tried to imitate grandeur on a smaller scale. A good funeral wasn't just about honoring the dead. It was about social survival for the living. To bury your loved one decently was proof that you had dignity, even in poverty. Some families went into debt for it. Entire savings vanished into funeral expenses. Undertakers offered payment plans, and debt collectors made rounds long after the mourners had gone home. Death, it seemed, was a business that never stopped collecting. And if there's one thing the Victorians excelled at, it was turning human feeling into marketable ritual. Grief became performance, love became luxury, and sorrow, in all its velvet and jet-black finery, became just another line item on the household ledger. Yet there's something strangely noble about it too. Beneath the commerce and etiquette, there was a yearning to make death meaningful, to shape chaos into ceremony. Even as undertakers counted profits and florists filled orders, ordinary people found comfort in structure. The rules of mourning gave shape to something shapeless, and in the end, that's what the Victorians were really buying. Not just a funeral, but the illusion of control. Because when everything around you, and from wallpaper to bread, might quietly kill you, the least you could do was make sure your death looked good doing it. All right, you've made it this far, so let's stay in our soft, candlelit Victorian haze for one last descent into the cemetery. Don't worry, we're not rushing anywhere. Just a quiet evening stroll through the marble gardens of eternity. Because if the Victorians did one thing beautifully, it was dying in style. By the mid-19th century, British cities were bursting at the seams. The Industrial Revolution had brought people and death in record numbers. Urban churchyards, once small peaceful patches of consecrated ground, were now overflowing with generations of Londoners stacked almost literally on top of one another. In some older parishes, the soil rose several feet above street level from centuries of burials. Gravediggers found bones with every new spadeful. The air wasn't exactly fresh, and the rain? It occasionally washed up a femur or two. So Parliament decided enough was enough. In the 1830s and 40s, a new movement began. The creation of garden cemeteries and large, landscaped burial grounds built outside city limits. They were meant to be sanitary, peaceful, and almost park-like, a place where the living could visit, mourn, and maybe enjoy a quiet picnic beside a granite angel. The first and most famous was Kensal Green Cemetery, opened in 1833, soon followed by Highgate, Brompton, and several others collectively known as the Magnificent Seven. They weren't just burial grounds, they were architectural marvels. Imagine wide, tree-lined avenues winding past Gothic chapels, Egyptian obelisks, and mausoleums that looked like miniature cathedrals. The Victorians adored symbolism. Every column, urn, and carved dove meant something. Even the layout was designed for the afterlife to feel orderly. Graves were arranged in neat rows, separated by winding paths and iron fences. Wealthier families bought entire plots surrounded by stone borders, creating little neighborhoods of the dead. And of course, status mattered here too. The closer your grave was to the main avenue or chapel, the higher your social standing, both in life and in death. Being buried near the entrance, where visitors passed often, was considered premium real estate. Some families even competed to outdo their deceased neighbors. Massive tombs, grand statues, elaborate ironwork. It was like a slow-motion architectural duel of mourning. One newspaper in 1862 noted, "The pride of the living follows them even into the grave." Highgate Cemetery, in particular, became the elite resting place. Its catacombs glowed with candlelight during evening services. Famous writers, politicians, and industrialists all lay within. Even Karl Marx would eventually join them, although his monument, with its massive stone head, came later and didn't quite blend in with the angels. But let's not forget the Victorian obsession with memorials. For a culture so consumed by mortality, they were surprisingly imaginative about remembrance. Tombstones weren't just markers, they were stories. A broken column meant a life cut short. A sleeping child represented innocence. A clasped hand meant farewell, sometimes even sculpted from the exact molds of the deceased's own hands. Some graves had little windows built into them, where families could look down and see the coffin, a literal connection to the underworld. Others had ventilation pipes meant to freshen the air, just in case the dead got stuffy. But perhaps the most touching were the epitaphs, often long, sentimental and heartbreakingly earnest. Lines like, "Not lost, but gone before," or "We shall meet again where parting is no more." Even the poorest families scraped together pennies for modest headstones, because not being remembered was worse than dying itself. Cemeteries also became social spaces. On Sundays, Londoners would stroll through them in their best clothes. Artists sketched, lovers wandered, families picnicked. For a society that feared decay, they sure enjoyed dining next to it. It wasn't morbid, it was moral. To walk among the graves was to be reminded of virtue, humility, and one's place in the grand cycle. But there was a practical side to it all, too. Cemeteries were safer. They kept death and its potential diseases away from crowded city streets. They also gave undertakers and masons a steady stream of work. The Victorians might have been sentimental, but they were also very efficient about it. Then came the great paradox. For all their reverence for the dead, Victorians were terrified of being buried alive. Premature burial wasn't just an urban legend. It was an actual fear, fed by medical mishaps and newspaper horror stories. People requested special coffins with escape mechanisms, little bells, air tubes, even flags that could be raised from inside. One inventor patented a safety coffin with a glass viewport and a spring-loaded lid, perfect for anyone planning a dramatic comeback. It rarely happened, of course. But the idea that it might become one of those oddly comforting anxieties that Victorians carried, like superstition disguised as preparation. By the end of the century, death had fully transformed from a grim inevitability into an aesthetic, even spiritual experience. Cemeteries were no longer feared. They were celebrated as proof of civilization, beauty, and progress. And maybe, deep down, they offered something the Victorians desperately needed: stillness. In an age of constant motion, clattering trains, clanging factories, soot-filled skies, the cemetery was a rare place of silence. It was nature, art, and memory, all wrapped into one. The poet Christina Rossetti once wrote, "When I am dead, my dearest, sing no sad songs for me." It was a whisper of rebellion against the performative mourning of her age, but it also captured a longing for peace, something the Victorians, for all their rituals, never quite managed to find in life. And maybe that's the quiet irony of it all. The same people who filled their homes with arsenic wallpaper, mercury-laced hats and formaldehyde-filled parlors spent their Sundays tending to marble angels, building beautiful cities for the dead because the living world had become too toxic to breathe. When you stand in a Victorian cemetery today and under the ivy, beside the cracked stone angels, you can almost feel the hum of that strange balance: fear and beauty, science and superstition, sorrow and vanity. It's haunting but gentle, exactly how the Victorians would have wanted it. And that, dear listener, brings us to the end of our long, softly morbid journey through the deadly job of a Victorian-era baker and more. We've drifted from the flour-dusted dangers of arsenic bread to the quiet splendor of marble graves, from workers poisoned by progress to families comforted by ritual. So as you lie there now, warm, safe, hopefully toxin-free, take a breath and imagine that candle flickering out. The city quiets, the smog settles, and somewhere in the heart of a Victorian cemetery, another name fades gently beneath the moss. Sleep well, traveler of time. The past has done its part. Now it's your turn to rest. The gas lamps dim one by one. The carriages stop rattling over the cobblestones. And in some quiet corner of London, a baker locks up his shop, wiping the white dust from his sleeves, not knowing that his bread might outlive him. The soot settles on rooftops like ash from a dying fire. Somewhere an undertaker adjusts the feathers on a black horse, and a child presses her face against a frosted window, watching the plumes pass by, not with fear but fascination. 'Cause in her world, death isn't the end. It's just another kind of ceremony. There's something almost peaceful about that. The Victorians, with all their poisons and paradoxes, built a society that feared death but loved to decorate it, like wrapping despair in silk ribbon. Maybe they understood something we've forgotten: that life, for all its soot and sorrow, is still worth polishing until it gleams. So tonight, as the last lamp flickers out, picture those endless rows of marble angels leaning slightly under the London fog, watching over everyone who worked, wept, and worried through that peculiar, poisonous century. They're still there in their silence. And if you listen closely, You might hear the faint sound of a baker's bell. All right then, let's linger here a little longer, in that dim gaslit hush between the living and the dead. The night feels heavier now, the air thick with chimney soot and the soft rattle of carriage wheels echoing somewhere far away. London, the heart of the Victorian age, is still awake, but just barely. In one narrow street, the last baker of the night leans over his counter. His sleeves are rolled, his hands raw from kneading. The air smells faintly sweet, sugar, flour, and something just a little bit sharp. Arsenic, maybe. He doesn't know. No one does. He wipes his face with the back of his wrist, leaving a pale streak across his cheek like a ghostly fingerprint. Somewhere nearby, a chimney sweep coughs himself to sleep in a rented attic, black soot still crusted in his lungs. The factory girls have already gone home, their dresses grey with dust. The lamplighter passes under the window, one flame at a time disappearing into the mist, and then further out beyond the iron gates lie the cemeteries, the great resting grounds of the Victorians, their gardens of eternity. Even in death the city hums quietly. Wind moves through the ivy, angels tilt under their own weight. The marble is cold but not unkind. You can almost picture it, a foggy Sunday morning and families strolling through Highgate Cemetery like it's a public park. Children laughing between headstones, mothers laying wreaths of lilies, fathers straightening the ribbons on wreaths that cost half a week's wages. No one calls it morbid. It's just life politely brushing against death. And if you stood there long enough, you might notice how much it all looks like a strange kind of balance. The world of the living and the dead, folded neatly together. Coffins carved like cathedrals, gardens grown over bones. Beauty layered on decay, as if the Victorians believed that by decorating death enough they could make it behave. There's something both sad and soothing about that, because they weren't heartless. They were afraid of dying badly, afraid of not being remembered, afraid that progress, that shining word of the industrial age, might cost them their souls, so they built meaning out of marble. They dressed grief in velvet and lace. They wrote long epitaphs and took photographs of the departed, as if to say, "See? We were here. We mattered." And in a way it worked. Their cemeteries still stand. Their mourning customs still echo through ours. The black dresses, the flowers, the long walks through quiet rows of stone. We inherited all of it. Just gentler now, quieter. The irony is that for all their poisons, the Victorians gave us the blueprint for what it means to be tender in the face of decay, to find grace in the inevitable. So maybe when we think of that baker, the man breathing arsenic dust as he made his morning loaves, we shouldn't just pity him. Maybe we should admire him a little, because even surrounded by invisible death, he still rose every dawn, mixed his dough, and made something warm for the city to wake to. And maybe that's the soft truth the Victorians left behind, that beauty and danger, love and poison, life and death, they were never opposites. They were neighbors, sharing the same cobblestone street. So tonight let's leave them where they belong. Let the baker rest. Let the hatter set down his Mercury brush. Let the Undertaker close his ledger for the night. The lamps are out now. The fog is settling low. The marble angels keep their silent watch over the city that built its monuments on bones and dreams. And you can drift off knowing that every age, no matter how grim or gilded, has its quiet workers. Its bakers and sweepers, its mourners and dreamers, people who carried the world forward, one tired breath at a time. So close your eyes, the past will keep. The stories can sleep. The Victorians have had their say, and somewhere in that endless grey between soot and dawn, London exhales, soft, slow and final. Good night, traveller. Sleep well among the ghosts.